Hello, and welcome to ESG Talk, your go-to source for insights and advice from leaders in environment, social, and governance. I'm your host, Mandi McReynolds. Today, we're discussing the critical role that corporate boards must play for companies to respond successfully in today's challenging economic environment, as well as many environment, social, and governance issues. Joining me are two global, phenomenal experts in corporate governance and ESG. First, we have Paul Washington of the Conference Board. I had a privilege to meet with him as this think tank came together at a conference several years ago. It helps the world's leading companies understand the present issues that face them and use data and research to guide their decision making in the boardroom, as well as with the C suite and executive team. He is the executive director of the ESG Center. He'll talk to us today about some of their recent published reports and the role that the boards have to play in this critical era of ESG and stakeholder capitalism. The privilege that we have is that it's not just Paul you get to hear from today, but also Helle Bank Jorgensen. She is the CEO and founder of Competent Boards, which provides global peer-to-peer education to board members, executives, and investors on ESG risk. And of course, you know well with this show, opportunities. Helle is a member of the NASDAQ Center for the Board of Excellence and the World Economic Forum Expert Panel. She has authored the amazing books that you will find as an Amazon bestseller called Stewards of the Future, a guide for competent boards, and is currently working on her upcoming book, The Future of the Boardroom. Well, it's time to have some fun on the show today. Paul and Helle, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Mandi.
Delighted to be here.
Such an honor to have both of you here with us today. So let's dive in. Helle, let's start with you. How would you define a competent board in terms of corporate sustainability?
Oh, I love the question. First, when we talk about competent board, I think let me share like 5 C's that I believe paint a picture of the culture of a competent boards. And first, I would say curiosity. For example, about all of the good materials that comes from Paul and the Conference Board, but also from you as Workiva. Number 2, I would say consciousness and also a concern about what's best for the company and its stakeholders, both in the short but also the long term. Number 3, I would say being courageous and support these courageous decisions. 4, connected on the purpose of the company, but also what's the purpose of the board? Why are we here? And are we connected on that? And number 5, I would say the last, but perhaps not least, continued learning. And that's, of course, competent boards come in, give that up-to-date insight and share experiences from leaders from across the globe via certifications programs. But I also think that if you look at these 5 C's, if they are present in the boardroom, you will have board members wanting to have a sustainability understanding of the risk and the opportunities, and a boardroom who don't look at sustainability matters as a separate from the strategy, but as an part of that, kind of like natural part of the corporate strategy. And that is often the foundation for success of a corporate strategy.
Helle, I appreciated that you went there and for our audience, a little peer into the production room. Before we were starting, it was so interesting to see how curious the three of us are and talking about some of the latest research and data and how we think that's going to play out into the 2024 year. So, Paul, from your lens and some of the conversation we were having before we hit record, do you think corporate boards are really prepared to meet today's economical and environment social challenges? And why or why not? And I love how your curiosity kind of helps you unpack that question a little bit more.
Are boards prepared to meet the challenges today? Partially. I think that, when we've asked, when we've done surveys of corporate executives, for example, of their board's competence in certain areas, they'll say, well, about 2/3 of the executives say that their boards are knowledgeable about ESG issues and so forth. So that's actually pretty good. But here's what's different these days. The first is that boards do need a different mindset. In the past, you expected in the corporate boardroom for people to say, I know. And if you didn't know, then something was a problem. Now, given all the challenges that companies are facing, whether it's in generative AI or supply chains or climate, the better answer is, here's what we know, and here's what we are learning together. So it is a different mindset that I think boards need to bring to bear, and frankly, management needs to bring to bear, which is the one of constant learning. The other thing that I think is somewhat missing, and this is not just in the boardroom, it's in the C-suite as well, which is a recognition of the need for partnerships. Because both the opportunities and the risks these days are greater than any individual company can tackle on their own. So the Conference Board puts out an annual C-suite outlook survey, and a majority of CEOs around the world, 52 or 54%, I think, say that the transition to renewable energy is going to be good for their particular company. And yet, renewable energy is one of their lowest internal priorities this year. That's on the opportunity side. So there's this big opportunity sitting out there that's too big for any company to address on its own. It requires public-private partnership. It requires partnership within the private sector to take advantage of it. On the risk side, we asked CEOs and others, is your company prepared for any of 15 major risks, including ones we know we've either gone through or they're coming? Inflation, recession, pandemic, cybersecurity attacks. You know something? A majority of CEOs around the world say their companies are not prepared for any of those 15 major risks. That's extraordinary. But I think the answer is that you cannot be prepared on your own. You need horizontal collaboration within your industry. You need vertical collaboration within your supply chain and your consumer chain. And you need, of course, government collaboration. So I think there's this shift to learning, which is critical. And I think we're making progress there for sure.
Paul, I want to build on something that you said there, which was really intriguing, where you talked about this continuous learning driving as we think about boards are facing an incredible time to look at the low carbon economy transition. And Helle, before we started, we were all talking about it is a global election year, right? Not wherever you may be. We have 140 countries plus that tune into the show. Wherever you may be, there's kind of global elections happening around the globe. So how are you seeing boards changing their structure and their operations to deal with these challenges? And some of what Paul's saying is like move towards partnership.
We have put out a survey of Fortune 500 companies, both Fortune 500 companies in the US and Fortune 500 companies in Europe. And that survey showed that a remarkable 2% of Fortune 500 companies, both places, have a boardroom with sustainability competences in abundance. 4% of those Fortune 500 companies, both in Europe and the US, do not disclose if they have any sustainability competences in the boardroom. And well, I mean, the rest falls in between, with some directors being sustainability or ESG competent. But is it enough to just have one person who understands sustainability? And it goes to your question, Mandi. No, it's no longer enough. You have a duty of care. Care about the most material risk of the company that you serve, as you were pointing out, Paul. And it's 2024. Sustainability, ESG risks are material company risks. And everyone in the boardroom needs to have some sort of sustainability literacy. And that's why also I see, companies saying, okay, we have a few people in the sustainability committee. That's no longer enough. You also have the audit committee, you have the non-gov, you have the risk committee, etc. And everyone needs to have some sort of sustainability, ESG expertise, so they can see the risk, also see the opportunities, and make sure that they are constantly keeping up to date with all the new regulations. And let me just say that that is a tsunami that's coming at us. So we better get going if board of directors have not ensured that they have enough expertise around the boardroom, not only in one person, but around the boardroom.
Well, I would love to keep this a little lighthearted. So Helle, we'll go with you, and because you talked about the regulation and the tsunami that's coming. Give it a number. Let's rate global boards around the world. A scale 0 to 5, 0 being the lowest, 5 being the highest. Where do you think we are as boards understanding and readiness for this ever evolving regulatory environment and the tsunami that's coming?
I mean, you want me to give a number. I think it depends on who you're talking to, and this might be the business lawyer or the accountant in me talking now. But I think before we talk about understanding, let's talk about awareness. There are many leaders out there that are actually not aware of what is hitting them. And it's not like, oh, perhaps it will come. We have had all of these voluntary sustainability standards now for years. I'm dating myself. I started over 30 years ago, all of this, and the first green account in the world, and the first integrated report in the world, etc. At that point, it was voluntary. It's no longer. And there are many leaders that have not yet woken up to the fact that it is now becoming regulation. And regulation that does not only kind of like say, oh, it can cost us a little fine. No, it can cost us big fines, and you can lose your reputation. But also in some countries, actually now it seems like you can be put in jail. France have just come out with, in terms of that directors actually can be put in jail in terms of the sustainability reporting. So all of this so-called non-financial information that we have been talking about, it now need or will need to be audited, signed off by the board, by the auditors. So as I said, we've come a long way since I started my career. That tsunami that hit companies and will hit companies and board members who are not prepared, well, you better learn to surf. So I think that's one of it. The other thing is, for those who are aware, and that gets to your question, there's a lot of confusion. And I fully get it. I mean, we have regulation in Europe that impacts companies in the US and in other countries. We have a global standard that is part of the international financial disclosure standards. We have regulation in California. We have upcoming SEC regulation. And when you look at the subsidiaries of many of these companies around the world, they are or they will be subject to local regulations. So I often say my best advice is to look at the stricter regulation that might be in the EU at the moment and get on with it before someone else do it. This is not about reporting everything. It's about reporting what's material for the business, for what time horizon, and why. And this is not just for regulation. You'll be asked by finance providers, you'll ask by insurance, employees, customers. So I'm afraid there's only one way, and that's forward, and that's clearly, that's also why we as competent boards exist, to make it easier and make boards and leaders smarter, so they can make smart decisions that are good for the company, that are good for the shareholders, and of course other stakeholders. And I think, Paul, you as well, right? So
if I might, I'll just jump in with a couple numbers that I think are going to address exactly what you're saying. When we did our C-suite outlook survey, the chief legal officers and the heads of sustainability at corporations around the world said the number 2, right after inflation, the number 2 most important factor affecting their company in 2024 were international and domestic regulation. They were tied. So your legal folks and your ESG folks recognize that this is huge. For CEOs, they rank domestic regulation, as do boards, sort of, in the top 10. But when it came to international regulation, they ranked it number 20, and board members ranked it 26. The difference is between 2 and 26. 3,000 US companies it's estimated, are going to be affected by the European CSRD, right? That is huge. That's the centerpiece of that tsunami. And that just shows that when it comes to regulation in particular, there is an underappreciation at both the C-suite level and the boardroom of what's coming. And I couldn't agree more that the way to address this is not just, oh, here's a painful regulation we've got to comply with. Actually, it's to take this regulatory exercise, which is going to require every company affected to have conversations with all of their suppliers upstream and downstream, basically talking about 10 different ESG topics under the CSRD, right? And they're going to have those conversations. So the challenge for companies is this is too important to leave to the lawyers. The challenge for companies is to enlist their business executives and say, not just where do we spend the most money now, but where are we going to be spending more money in the future? And where are our key partners in helping us on our own particular sustainability journey, and having not just legal conversations, compliance conversations, but business conversations with those upstream and downstream partners and say, all right, there seems to be some white space here. You're trying to do this in supply chain responsibility. This is what we're trying to do. Well, what technology would enable us to do this better together? Should we engage in a joint venture to pursue that? This regulatory tsunami can actually be put to corporate advantage if it's approached as an opportunity, business opportunity identification mode, and also a risk mitigation mode. That's going to and not just a regulatory compliance exercise.
I couldn't agree more. I think we're going to see this collide, especially as regulation tsunami, 2024, 2025, 2026 become key years. And then if you look ahead 5 more years, you're going to see the impact of the sustainable development goals and kind of a world of reckoning as companies have made commitments happening. So financial transformation and sustainable transformation will hit this merger within the next 2 years as companies grapple with that. We've talked about it from a large scale notion of the world and the large corporate rooms, but let's talk about the dollars and the cents, Paul, right at the individual level. So should boards link compensation to ESG goals? And from either of you, are there any examples that we feel like, hey, these are some strong ones for people to consider if they want to go down this route of individually linking motivation versus just at the higher corporate level?
Sure. Well, they are doing it, especially in the US. We just put out a report on this. 76% of the S&P 500 linked executive compensation in some way to ESG performance in 2023, compared to 67% in 2021. The most common area where companies are linking performance to pay to performance in this arena is in human capital management. 90% of companies who link compensation to ESG do so in that field. The most popular metric in the United States among the S&P 500 is DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion metrics. 75% of the companies linking exec comp to ESG do that, so 3/4 of them. And greenhouse gas emissions, that's 39% of the firms linking in the S&P 500, linking pay to ESG performance are tying it to GHG measures. So that's what's happening. I actually think that what's happening is, I hope it's only the first generation of this, because I think companies are candidly somewhat missing the boat here, right? Because what matters here is not an isolated GHG metric. It's not an isolated DEI metric. It's actually how companies are doing in integrating sustainability more broadly into their business. This was mentioned earlier. So greenhouse gas emissions, climate doesn't exist on its own. It's part of an interrelated set of issues relating to waste and water and biodiversity. And of course, climate's all involved. And so maybe you should be thinking about, what are we doing more generally with environmental responsibility? What progress are we making more generally toward our goals that are well suited to our company? Diversity, equity, inclusion. Diversity is not a goal in and of itself. It is to enable you to perform better as a company. And so I actually hope that companies shift away from the convenient off-the-shelf metrics and start to think more deeply about how these areas truly relate to their strategy. And I will give you one very practical thing a company I know did in this area is that they ran with these metrics for a couple years without ever linking compensation to it. They said, okay, we're going to measure how we're doing in this particular area. I think it related to supply chain and some other areas. And they said, is it making a difference? Are people responding? And then once they realized that those were relevant metrics, they were motivating metrics, then and only then did they tie compensation to it. The final thing I'll suggest is as you're thinking about what we were talking about in terms of what's really going to move the needle here, shouldn't companies provide metrics relating to partnerships, an effective partnership? Shouldn't that be something you're measuring? And we know that embedding sustainability into your business is something that only 13% of US companies say they're very far advanced on. But we also know that embedding sustainability into your culture, right? So everyone understands the issues. That's going to be the font of innovation. So maybe we should be measuring sustainability culture integration. And there are ways of doing that, not just GHG or DEI metrics. So I think there's an extra level of sophistication and tailoring that can happen with these metrics that we have not yet seen.
And if I may add on to what you're saying and saying for all of that, I think we not only should look at new forms of incentives, but let's look at the current incentives. You do not want to establish a culture of no consequences with nice purpose statements and goals. But you also have this, if you don't have consequences, if the goals are not met, what then? So again, I think we need to remember it's strategic business risk and opportunities. And I have, we have these global certification programs, and we have a debate with board members if you should pay for good behavior and doing the right thing, or it should be an underpin where you are not getting your bonus unless these goals and behaviors are met as well. But again, I think the most important is perhaps to look at the existing incentive compensation plans and ensure that the sustainability and ESG factors are embedded. Think about your procurement. You were talking about supply chain, Paul. Let's think about procurement. A procurement executive that is being incentivized by getting, the best, cheapest products without thinking about modern slavery, without thinking about other human rights issues, without thinking about the long-term viability of the supplier due to climate, biodiversity issues, geopolitical issues, technological risk, etc. That's not smart. We want to ensure that the incentives are constructed in a way that brings value both financially and from a reputational, but also a business success lens. And I think that's important. I often say to companies, show me your incentives, and I should show you the problems that can come your way, because we have embedded so many things into our incentive structures that we don't always see the risk that we have embedded there as well. And those risks are simply getting higher and higher on the list right now.
So I was talking to a company the other day where they were about to forego an acquisition of a company, an upstream supplier, because it would add to their carbon footprint, because it was going to increase the company's overall GHG emissions, right? And so it was actually in the best interest of the company and frankly society for them to bring this upstream supplier in-house. Now, sure, it boosted their greenhouse gas emissions, but it didn't do so for society. In fact, over time, they were going to be able to bring them down. So, but that's one of the things that I think people have to, if they're going to have these metrics embedded in their programs, they have to make sure that these metrics don't stand in the way, actually, of progress, which they can if they're just off the shelf, static, strict metrics. I just think there's a level of sophistication here about embedding sustainability into your strategy, into your operations, into your culture, across everything you do in the marketplace, the workplace, and the public space. And as it's embedded in all honesty, the compensation the specific metrics that you're then sort of encouraging people to achieve or to avoid become somewhat less important because it's built into your overall company's performance.
Well, and as we think about the companies moving forward despite backlash, grappling with this challenge of the evolution of transformation from the sustainable and business side colliding, a twist on what both of you are talking about is looking internally at the organizations with the board. Let's change our focus with the audience and talk a little bit about the external stakeholder. A big one in the room, especially if you're a publicly traded company, is investors. So, Workiva recently had a survey where we know that more than 80% of investors have said they're not going to change how they make investment decisions despite criticism or backlash, or even maybe some of the deep conversations we were just having, right? Of how we grapple with this idea of performance versus impact. What do you think? And let's put some time horizon on this. What do you think investors over the next 2 years, getting really tight, 2 years, will wield on boards and ESG as we look ahead?
I think they're going to continue to wield significant impact, but it's relatively less than in the past. So we've been operating in recent years in a sort of pro ESG echo chamber that was largely driven by major institutional investors. And so when Larry Fink or other heads of major investment firms spoke, boards really sort of followed suit because the cost benefit analysis was pretty clear. Because if you didn't do what your big institutional investors said you should do, you could see you could see support for shareholder proposals, you diminish support for the board, open yourself up for activism. So that's the world we were in. Now, major institutional investors, where they're saying they're not changing their policies, are changing their posture. So they are much less vocal and on the forefront of supporting shareholder proposals on ESG. We saw an 8% drop in average support from 31% in 2022 to 23% in 2023 for ESG proposals. Environmental proposal support dropped by 14 points from 34 to 20. So investors are less vocal than they were in the past. But here's where they are still putting pressure. They're asking boards. They're now being less prescriptive, but they are asking boards what they are doing to address environmental, social, governance risks and opportunities. So I think the pressure is still there from investors. But what is fundamentally changing in the mix is that the pendulum is shifting, where this is really an investor-driven dynamic to one where two other parties are really stepping up in terms of their influence, including in the next 2 years. Regulators, which we've already talked about, regulators are going to be driving this a lot. The other people who are going to be driving this a lot are business partners. I think the B2B space is where a lot of this is happening. Your business customers are going to be expecting you to help them on their sustainability journey. So they're going to be asking you what you're doing about diversity, what you are doing about environmental issues. And those procurement officers, whether they're government procurement officers or they're private sector procurement officers, they're going to be putting pressure on you. So I think the investor pressure is still going to be there. It's going to be a little more discerning, a little less prescriptive. But what's really notable in the next 2 years is how it's going to be balanced, and sometimes maybe even counterbalanced, by pressure from regulators and from business partners.
If I should take a stab at it, and I think I agree with you, Paul, but I do see that those investors that have looked at sustainability, ESG, risk and opportunities as what is really material to the business and to the going concern of the business, to the success of the business, both in the short and the long term, they're not changing. And Mandy, I'm almost more concerned about the 20% that indicate that have stopped doing, according to your survey. It's hard not to say that all of these changes we're seeing in the world is not going to impact the company. If you can't get your supply, if you can't get people to come and work for you, if you can't get your customers to buy your products, if climate change or climate have disrupted the way you do business, if your peers, competitors, have started looking at things in a different ways, have reinvented their business model, starting to look at how can we reduce all of this waste? How can we do things in a different way? And you're not doing it? Well, investors will be looking at that, being that in terms of, I mean, also think about private equity, right? That's the same. They're also looking at what are the companies that they can bring to the next level. So yes, we have a lot of discussions and a lot of talk, and I think it's healthy that we go in and say what is really material for the business. This is not just about putting every single measure we can think of down. This is understanding what is material for the business, what's material for the shareholders, for the stakeholders, which is then material for the business, and both in the short term and the long term. And you can't understand that if you don't have that board of directors have the insight, the management have the insight. And that's also where, the EU regulation is saying that you need to disclose the level of competences of both the administration, the management, and the board of directors. And that's why, at competent boards, we're seeing so many directors saying, okay, I need to make sure I'm upskilled on all of these areas, and my business, my company, that we can actually report that we have a sustainability competent board.
I think where we do agree is I think good investors or thoughtful investors are going to be taking a more sophisticated approach to companies here and not expecting them all to be in lockstep on making the same kind of disclosures and addressing the same areas. So they're going to be looking more toward how is each board in each company addressing its sustainability opportunities and risk. So I think that what is going to be needed and is happening at some major investment houses is a shift away from the generic approach that every company needs to be doing A, B, or C to a more tailored approach.
This has been a fabulous discussion. I know for myself and our executive team, as we are preparing to enter into our boardroom discussions throughout 2024, should we be optimistic that companies and organizations around the globe, and think of those in our audience, that we will achieve both financial and sustainable transformation or outcomes in the next 18 months of some kind? Or do you see it as we should be more pessimistic, and more cynicism entering the boardroom?
Well, I'm a pragmatic optimist. I think I said that before as well, and I see with the number of boards and leaders that want to get upskilled, and with the different forces who nudge and demand others to be upskilled, I think we'll get there. I think the future boardroom will look different. I think it might even look younger, perhaps more diverse, but also more engaged in what is best for the company, what's best for the shareholders, what's best for the stakeholders, both in the short and long term. So again, I'm kind of like pragmatic optimist.
Yeah, I'm optimistic as well. I think that despite ESG backlash and the skepticism, and by the way, there's a whole bunch of different flavors of that, from legitimate skepticism to outright political opportunism. But despite all that, I think that boards and management teams will continue on their journey of embedding sustainability more deeply into their business, tailoring it in ways that make sense. I think that is happening. But a couple things. One thing that is happening that is competing for space, because there has been an ESG bandwagon that everyone else jumped on at the company right now, but now there's an AI bandwagon, right? And so there are other issues that will crowd out maybe the focus on sustainability and ESG. I don't think it needs to happen. In fact, I would suggest that artificial intelligence and how companies grapple with it is a perfect test of a company's approach to balancing multiple stakeholder interests and acting in a socially and environmentally responsible way.
But if I may there, and I totally agree with you that AI, we also have cybersecurity, we also have geopolitical issues, we also have so many other issues. Corruption is still an issue, right? And in the certification programs we have all of those matters that is embedded in there because they all related and they're all going to impact the sustainability matters as well as sustainability the other way around.
Helle and Paul, thank you so much for your insightful, thoughtful, and I will say intriguing conversation as we've covered so many different topics today about being ready for competent boards and the boardroom together with our listeners. It gives us a lot to unpack as we all strive to remain pragmatic, as Helle said, and a balance of optimism as we head through the rest of this year. So thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of ESG Talk, brought to you by Workiva, the world's only unified platform for financial reporting, ESG, audit, and risk. For more on business leadership and ESG, I recommend checking out a recent episode with PJT partners Amelia Pan and Cognizant's Aya K. Morocco, titled Sustainability and the C-Suite. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this episode, please rate or review us on Apple Podcasts and subscribe to see future episodes on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. We'll talk real soon.